Mine really is to sort of to provide a bit of context to a lot of to some of the things that we've had from the two presentations. And that context is really history. How do we get, so we are in this space and these conversations about electoral justice, the meaning of whether our elections are free and fair, and if they are not free and fair, what recourse do we have for making elections accountable? And that recourse, as we have developed it, is around going to the Supreme Court, as we've attempted to do since 2013, and the experiences that we've had with the Supreme Court when we've gone there. And Wachira has talked about that in reflection. And also Jim has talked about how the Supreme Court has handled some of the complaints that go before it. But how did we get here historically? And so the question that Wachira has put at the end of his presentation, and that is also inherent in the presentation by Jim, is how do we move forward if we have all these complaints about the attempts at accountability through the Supreme Court? And to understand or to try and answer the question of how do we move forward, we have to really go back to the question of how did we get to the Supreme Court as the place to go to in the first place? What is the history of where we find ourselves in today? That history goes back to the founding of the Republic of Kenya in 1963, the first constitution of 1963, which established two elections in charge, two organs in charge of elections. One was a court called, one was the Electoral Commission of Kenya, and the second was a court called the Supreme Court. And I will talk about that in a short while, and then it provides some of the context. The Electoral Commission, as established in the 1963 Constitution, was made up of the Speaker of the Senate as the chair, the Speaker of the House of Representatives as the vice chair, a person appointed to that to the Electoral Commission by the Governor General, and a person, 8 people, each representing one of the 8 regions into which the country was divided by that constitution. That was the ECK of 1963. That was the body that was running elections. It was a body very close to the political establishment. That was also very much, you couldn't say that it was independent because its leadership was embedded in the legislature as of that time. And subsequent reforms have moved the ECK, as we then knew it, outside of the controls of the legislature and the controls of the executive as at that time. Now, the other election organ in the 1963 Constitution was the judiciary itself, and there was a court called the Supreme Court in 1963. The Supreme Court of 1963 is actually what ended up as the High Court that we know today. So the 1963 Constitution had the Supreme Court as the court of original jurisdiction, and then above the Supreme Court was the Court of Appeal. So a renaming of the Supreme Court happened, and that court became the High Court, with the Court of Appeal that became the highest court of the land, having appellate jurisdiction. In 1963, as the country emerges out of colonial rule and becomes, and we gain independence, this is the executive leadership. The Queen is the sovereign in Kenya. The Governor General appointed by the Queen is the head of state, and a Prime Minister appointed by the Governor General is the leader in Parliament. And so when we have elections in 1963, we have elections for the houses, the House of Representatives and the House of and the Senate. Those are, and then lower elections. There was no presidential election as at 1963 because there was no president. So the Constitution did not provide for, and did not need to provide for how to resolve presidential election disputes because there was no election for, the position of president had not been established. The Queen could not be elected or not. That's the head of state. The Governor General, an appointee of the Queen, and the Prime Minister are selected by the Governor General from among members of the House of Representatives. So the Prime Minister comes from Parliament, having been elected as an MP. So when you have the Supreme Court, which became the High Court, as the judicial organ for resolving electoral disputes, it is resolving electoral disputes relating to election as a member of Parliament only, because there was no presidential election, because there was no president as at 1963. In 1964, when Kenya attained Republican status, we have a president for the first time. The constitutional provisions relating to presidential disputes, relating to electoral disputes, remained unchanged. So we have an elected president, but no responsible constitutional mechanism for how to resolve disputes relating to that election. You get that? Is that point made? So we have a 1963 election, constitution that properly can't deal with presidential elections because there were none. In 1964, when for the first time we have a president, we can have a president that is elected, the Constitution does not respond to the possibility that there can be disputes relating to the presidential election. That is the constitutional dispensation that we had until 2010. That is, in 2010, this is the first time the country deliberately tries to deal with the possibility of a presidential electoral dispute and how can that be addressed. Notwithstanding the fact that we did not have a deliberate constitutional mechanism for addressing disputes relating to the election of the president, attempts were made. So I go back to say, then we have our first president, Prime Minister Jomo Kenyatta, restyles himself as president without a popular election, governs and rules the country until he dies without ever facing the people of Kenya in an election. Moi comes and does not face the people of Kenya in an election until 1992. When he faces the people of Kenya in an election in 1992, a dispute arises for the first time about his election. What are the constitutional mechanisms for dealing with that dispute? It is the 1963 provisions that remain in place when we had no possibility of a presidential election. And those are the ones that then Matiba uses to go to the High Court, which has with the court that was called the Supreme Court in 63, has been renamed as the High Court, and those are the mechanisms that Matiba uses to try and unseat Moi in 1992. What is Matiba's experience? The first experience is delay. His presidential petition is not resolved by the High Court until 24 months after the election it related to. 24 months is 2 years. A week is a long time in politics. 24 months, 2 years is an eternity in politics. If you go to court and present the court with the possibility that it can upset a president who has been in office for 2 years, has appointed ministers, who have appointed people, you've created a political situation that makes it very difficult for a court of law to nullify that election. That is the truth of the matter. If you go to 1997, Matiba fails, and you can understand how he has failed. If you go to 1997, we have Kibaki then challenging Moi. That dispute is resolved after 12 months. That is still an eternity. And again, present you with the fact that it is very difficult to upset an election so late into the electoral season. So the first time we have, and Gladwell wants me to stop, the first time we have a deliberate attempt to deal with all these issues is then in the new constitution of 2010. And how do we deal with it? We establish a Supreme Court, the one now we know. That Supreme Court is a much higher court. It has original jurisdiction over this dispute, which means once they go to that court, they can't be appealed, so there's finality. There's also, the court itself is very elevated because it's the highest court created over the existing courts. And then the other mechanism that we put in is how time is managed. It is not going to be 24 months of 92. It's not going to be 12 months of 97. It is going to be 14 days. And it is going to, and nothing moves until the court speaks, which means we freeze politics until the court speaks. So those are the mechanisms that we have put in place, hoping then, and those mechanisms are very deliberate, and they're the basis of some kind of social, political elite consensus that after the experience of 2007, where people fight and go to the streets, we are not going to have that again. We're going to establish this thing, and it's going to be the one that gives us a true north of Kenyan politics. In 2013, the court speaks, and Wachira has talked about how it is beaten back. In 2017, the court speaks a different way, and it's beaten back for speaking back a different way. In 2022, it has spoken, and it is spoken in a way that raises more questions than answers about its validity. We are at a point where, again, we must make decisions about the future of this country, but that future has got to be understood in the context of that history that I have tried to provide a snapshot about. Thank you very much.